There's a huge range of them on the
There certainly
website, except for the rude ones, which cuts it by 90%. The remaining 10% are posted. Richard, let's come to you as our new political editor. What did you make of all that?
Well, I'm completely apolitical, actually. I don't have any sort of allegiance to any party whatsoever. But I would agree with half of what was said there. Clearly, Cameron was much fleeter of foot than he has been. He was quite funny. I liked his jokes. I liked what first attracted you to the Lib Dems and all that. That was all good. But I thought the blows were quite light, actually. And I didn't see the Prime Minister really being particularly bruised or battered. I don't think he was battered, and I don't think he did drown. In fact, I think he's been looking increasingly confident. And if I was a Tory, I'd be getting a bit worried now. I mean, the gap in the polls is closing. As I say, that was a deft performance by Cameron, but he's not really, I don't think, scoring major important hits. And I'll tell you what I think about...
Maybe they should employ you to advise them, because it looks like they need all the help they can
I'll
get.
pop down and speak to Dave any time he likes. But I have to say this about the Tories at the moment. They're kind of playing the game a bit like England used to play on the football pitch in the late 70s and 80s. They're just passing the ball back and passing it from side to side. There aren't any bold runs, going down the wing. It's all very static play. Now, maybe you're right, and they're just biding their time and keeping their powder dry. But if they're not, then I think, for the first time, I'm actually seeing the reality of a hung parliament. I think it could happen.
Well, which is what the latest polls would suggest if they were to play out an election. Why has the Conservative lead gone from around 15 points, 16 points to 7?
Because we are trying to make difficult arguments. I mean, that is the reality. I mean, last autumn, George Osborne made the argument that cutting the deficit needed to be the central priority of whoever wins the next election. That is a difficult argument to make. Sure. It's a brave argument to make. And now we are making a different argument, which George Osborne announced yesterday, which is about how we get growth back into the economy. These are not simple things to say. And what I just finished.
Sure.
We want to win the election with a mandate to do the right things and not just to say what needs to be said. And that's why I think, this is a time not for thinking about the polls moving up 1% or down 1%, but actually winning those big arguments.
Sure, but actually your lead's been cut by 50%. It's not a point here or there. Are you saying that you've lost half your lead in the polls because of what you say?
No, I'm saying that if
you're...
what you have to do...
Just shut up and then you lead.
It's if you're going to make the arguments that will give you the authority to govern, the mandate that you need to make difficult changes, the next government is not going to have the option of being a steady hand on the tiller. And you need that mandate. And I think there are some very difficult points that have to be got across.
That would suggest that you need better help and a more sophisticated way of getting your message across. Because I understand what you're saying. You're saying we don't want to be elected without people realising it's going to be tough after we've won. I understand that. And you're trying to be honest with the people by your lights. And I understand that too. But if that's what you're trying to do, and the result is you've gone from 15 to 7-point lead in the polls, your message ain't getting out properly.
Well, you're taking a snapshot of 2 points in time, but actually the overwhelming message of the polls is actually that the Conservatives have been ahead in the polls. We've been ahead consistently in the polls.
But you've been
for the
all
last
the
18
recent
months.
polls show you in hung Parliament territory. Before Christmas, they all showed you with an overall majority.
But do you think the public want a party that reacts violently to this move in the polls or that move in the polls? Or do you think they want someone that actually makes the difficult arguments? Well, that's what this is about.
Well, they clearly are not sold by your difficult arguments. It was interesting, James, that the Leader of the Opposition did go on defence and electoral reform, cleverly, therefore, avoiding anything about the economy at the moment, even though the economy should be his strong suit.
Well, that was his tactical success today, as he managed to block out any sustained debate about the economy. It was left to Labour backbenchers to raise the issue for the Prime Minister to say his piece. By having two separate issues, you nail it down. It means the questioning doesn't get any kind of momentum. And specifically, you go on areas where the Conservatives believe the Labour are weak. They know that Gordon Brown is going to be appearing before Chilcot in a few weeks' time. They know that this whole issue about how he controlled defence spending when he was Chancellor is going to be a crucial issue. And the sheer weight of the evidence that has been given to the inquiry recently makes it's a position where I think the Prime Minister will have to be on the defensive. He will have to explain a great deal, which is why David Cameron went on it. As for AV, in theory,
that's the alternative vote,
electoral reform. That should be a strong suit for the Prime Minister. This week, he gave a speech yesterday, a new politics, and yet David Cameron managed to switch it round and say, actually, this is just about, fiddling, with reform in the run-up to the election. And that's a problem, I think, for the government, is that to claim they are electoral reformers this close to an election when they have stalled over so much, including Lord's reform, let's face it, and we know that they're stalling over the right committee reforms to the way Parliament organises itself and whether election, that means it's a difficult case for the government to make.
Let's look at this electoral reform, Liam Byrne. You promised it in your manifesto in 1997. You did nothing about it. You won a landslide election. You won another landslide election. You won a third election by a very large majority. Nothing about electoral reform. Now you look like you're heading to lose or a hung parliament. Suddenly you want electoral reform. I mean, it's just the most cynical manipulation.
Well, let's be clear that the reason that we haven't brought forward a proposition for proportional representation is that we couldn't secure a consensus for it. And that's what the Jenkins Commission was set up to try and find. And unfortunately, it failed.
But you promised it in your manifesto. You didn't promise other things in the manifesto and say, we're only going to do that if we can get a consensus. A promise is a promise. You broke that promise. You've come back to it now for pure reasons of electoral expediency.
No, we couldn't get a consensus around proportional representation. So now alternative vote, which is not, technically speaking, a form of proportional representation, we think is something that the British people should have the chance to give their opinion on. And so the only amendment that's being brought forward to the bill that is in the House next week, that will be the legislative device for this, is to say, look, before the end of 2011, let's give the British people a chance to say, do they want to change the voting system, yes or no?
Are you saying that you're doing this because you perceive that there is a public clamour for electoral reform?
No, we're saying that we think...
There's not.
No, we're saying that politics in this country needs to change. We
Sure.
need to get
I
politics...
understand that.
Just to finish...
But are you... No. Are you saying that one of the ways the British people want it to change is to change the voting system? Because if you're saying that, I'd like to see the evidence.
Well, we think that there is a demand in quite a large part of the country for the election of MPs
and the evidence?
with 50% of their constituency.
Well,
I don't think
I can't find it in any of the polls.
But I don't think we've done opinion polls on it. But I think it's something that we hear about and detect in the public mood, that they want to see the way politics is conducted in this country changed for good.
Am I missing something here? Is there a huge public
I think
clamour
you're
out
right
there?
on the money, and I do think it's a completely cynical political move, and it's so transparent. It's another example, I think, of Gordon Brown treating us like we're idiots. I mean, if he really thinks that we're going to swallow this at this late stage, and after the three sessions that this government has had to change things, I mean, it beggars belief. So no.
There is, just to explain maybe the Prime Minister's argument, one specific argument that does link expenses, distrust in politics with AV. There is an argument, it's not a consensual one, but there is an argument that says that under AV it is harder to have safe seats, therefore MPs would be less complacent, therefore they're less likely to fiddle their expenses.
It's an indirect
but that's a pretty tangent. It's a tangential argument.
But it's also part of a package.
I just say, I think there is one reason why this is a political move, which is that if Gordon Brown had really been committed to AV, he would have had a referendum at the general election. He chose to promise a referendum after the general election. Why? Because if there's a hung parliament, he wants